Terrific. Thank you so much. I was just commenting to one of my fellow panelists, when we look at multilateral Asian trade dynamics, we often talk about overcapacity in steel, overcapacity in production. Here we have an overcapacity in student planning capabilities. These clubs and organizations have a tremendous group of students who are coming together on a really interesting set of topics and discussion that relate to Canada, Japan, Korea, and the changing geopolitics of the Arctic. I'm excited to be here with such a distinguished panel and to learn a lot, like all of us today, as we go through this topic. And I want to begin with a set of questions for each of the panelists. And I'm going to start with Professor Calder down at the end. After those questions, I'll probably ask some other broader follow-up questions based on their comments, and then I'll moderate some Q&A. So I want you to be storing up your questions, which are, of course, polite, because look, we're all polite people up here. Polite questions, tough questions, and questions that are questions. Okay, this is a great skill to learn here in Washington. Ask a question, that's a question. So be thinking about that as you hear these panelists share their insights over the next few minutes. I do want to begin with Professor Calder, who has done remarkable work on geopolitics and on Asian geopolitics in particular. And in thinking about this topic, it struck me that in so much writing about geopolitics, you take as given the geography, the topography, and then you layer on it changing political orders and dynamics. Here we have a case where the geography is physically changing, right, because of changes in ice coverage and so forth, and the politics is dynamic at the same time. And so really, I'd love you to give us the sort of geopolitical primer on this topic. How strategically important is the Arctic? What does it mean for the changing maritime order? Connections between the Arctic and Pacific. Sort of lay out this tableau for us that will then inform the other topics as we dive into the role of each country and think about their roles together.
Well, thank you very much, Josh, and I certainly look forward to hearing from all the members of our panel today. It's been almost 10 years, but on a very similar topic, the US, Japan, and Canada in the Arctic. And former Ambassador Jonathan Freed, Canada's ambassador to Japan at the time, came to us at the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies and suggested that we combine with, the Pacific organization in Canada and the Reischauer Center and the Japan Foundation together to think about the question of the Arctic and how it was changing and how those three countries somehow could collaborate. I was delighted to have met Jim Boutillier at a conference that we did in Vancouver through that process. And one thing that struck me then and strikes me today, and this is Liberation Day, I should remind everyone. So in the kind of world where multilateralism is being so stridently attacked in some ways, there's a lot to be learned from thinking about how three countries can collaborate. And well, the three countries involved in this particular case don't involve the United States. We're talking Canada, Korea, and Japan particularly. But in the background, of course, the United States is there together with Russia and China as major players in this evolving tableau. And I just think it's an extraordinarily important subject. I look forward to hearing from people. I've been working on the area generally as a piece of a broader book that just came out about a month ago called Eurasian Maritime Geopolitics. And the point that I was making, the big point, was that the seas themselves are changing. Josh suggests in the Arctic that is particularly true because, of course, because of global warming, the seas or the configuration of the Arctic Ocean, what's passable, what's not, how that relates to the relations among the 8 members of the Arctic Council and others beyond, such as China and Japan and Korea, is really an important subject per se. So some of the main points that strike me as being very important in response to your question, Joss, that I began to think about in that book, some other work that some of you know that I've done on Eurasia over 3 books in the last decade that relate to Eurasia's transformation, and then a little piece that I did for Kyoto News just this over the weekend about Greenland, and which of course is a related subject and how Greenland relates to the United States and to Arctic geopolitics. The big point, I think, the first one is that in the short run, the Arctic, of course, is a low profile event. And there are, we'll pull out important issues that are quite immediate. However, the importance of the Arctic is in spades in the longer run, or over maybe a 3-year time horizon of, I would say even quicker. It will relate to whatever outcome we begin to see out of the Ukraine war, because it's profoundly related to the nature of the evolution of US-Russian relations. The basic point is that the Arctic, as it begins to warm, is going to potentially give, and this depends on how the countries we're talking about here, plus the United States, handle the issues of the Arctic, give considerable advantages above all to the Russians, I would say. 2/3 of the Arctic, the coastline of the Arctic Sea is on the Russian side. The northern sea route, the NSR on the Russian side is thawing most quickly. The level of global warming is at white heat, if you could put it that way, in the Arctic, rising 4 times as fast as in other major global regions, partly because, of course, underneath, and strikingly different from the Antarctic, because there's the sea underneath, and the seas are warming, and these things are feeding on one another. The basic global warming tendencies and the warming of the seas, and they're opening the sea first on the northern sea route. We've had some, I don't want to step on other things that will be said, but just to summarize, since roughly 2015, of course, we've begun to have some commercial transport between Scandinavia and Northeast Asia, including Korea, but also China and so on. There's considerable oil trade in 2024, more than had ever been in the past, between Russia and China. Over half of that was actually half of the trade along this northern sea route was oil trade between China and Russia, from the Arctic, the Russian Arctic, to China. But Russia has, they're going to thawing, their routes will thaw first. They'll thaw more rapidly than the Northwest Passage, for example, through Canada, which is the big alternative. There's major issues there that our Canadian participants can talk far better than I. Who is it that manages transportation through the Northwest Passage? Canada claims, the United States claims that this is an international sea route. There's some issues down the line, but of course, traditional allies, a set of issues that aren't as sticky as the ones over on the Russian side. So the Russian side begins to thaw first. Once it becomes more open sea, for the first time in over 300 years since Peter the Great, the Russians will have an open sea coast. So the potential for Russian submarine, of course, the Barents Sea, even now is a major area for deployments at one of their sea bastions around Murmansk, where Putin, of course, was just a couple of days ago talking about the importance of the Arctic. Russia has 35 or so military bases in the Arctic. They've been expanding rapidly. They have 35 or so icebreakers, which is by orders of magnitude more than anybody else. The United States has 2 that are operational. Canada, fortunately, has more. Canada, the United States, and Finland, in the last days of the Biden administration, of course, went forward, have begun to go forward with a cooperative program of icebreakers. That just to flag one issue that I look forward to hearing about. So, there's some thinking in terms of response, but the big issue is the Russians and the emergence of an open water in the north and how that will affect Russia's emerging role in world affairs. Now, if that were not enough, there's the issue of the synergy between China and Russia in this. And I know at least 2 of our speakers are well versed, and I don't want to preempt what they will say, but it's a multifaceted partnership. In my own supercontinent book and in the New Continentalism, I strongly felt from that research, and I felt it again in my latest one, that really the ties between China and Russia give China a considerable preeminence, a considerable ability to dominate that relationship. And the idea of pulling the 2 of them apart by striking a special deal with the Russians, either over the Ukraine or whatever, to me is highly unlikely to yield results favorable to the allied nations. The key in all of this really is China. Because of its greater economic potential, more rapidly growing economy, and so on. Of course, Russia, depending on the terms, and I look forward to hearing from Whitney and others what they think those terms might be. But, the Russians would love to probably get some advantages, some concessions, cryogenic technology, relating to exploiting energy in cold climates or whatever it is from the United States. But these are more a matter of supporting them rather than special concessions in return for, say, something relating to the Ukraine. Anyway, so finally, of course, our subject here profoundly concerns Japan, Korea, well, and of course, particularly Canada. And in terms of thinking about that, and also the general future of this relationship, I think we have to distinguish between 2 things in predicting the future. First, the predictable elements of the future, and secondly, the critical uncertainties. The predictable element, I think, is, as I said, global warming. The critical uncertainties are US-Russia relations, of course, so timely right now because of the Ukraine crisis. And I never thought I would say this, US-Canada relations in the current situation, marked by Liberation Day today, the tariffs, and so on, and what happens there. Now, the way this is sort of formulated in terms of thinking about Korea, Japan, Canada, how do they relate to all this? Of course, implicitly there, that doesn't include the United States, but I was asked to say a word about that, those other linkages, and where are they? How do they relate? This is presumably, if we're thinking the United States out of the equation. Obviously, energy is one area of synergy. At least I would like to hear from the other participants about that, where they see the energy relations between Canada and, well, one of them is LNG, obviously. Canada could have even better access, between British Columbia and the Pacific than the Alaskan pipeline, which is being proposed by President Trump, at least more economically viable. The other relations, I'm sure they can speak to those. I mentioned icebreakers, dealing with the Arctic, the whole question of transportation from the Northwest Passage as that begins to open. The other big question is how everyone sees, to me, the Sino-Russian linkage, which is so fundamentally important in thinking about the Arctic future. In both the Yamal Peninsula, LNG, I think I said this, 80% of Russia's LNG income is out of the Arctic, out of two projects, basically the Yamal, which has already begun to come on stream, and then Arctic 2, which is up in the air. I mean, the facilities are pretty much completed, the first LNG trains, but the question, it's highly subject to sanctions and the resolution of those kind of issues. But China is deeply involved with Russia in both. And as I said, half of the trans-Arctic trade now is oil exports, not gas so much now because of sanctions, but those oil exports from, from the Arctic to China. So how will the China-Russia linkage sort out, and to what extent and how will that relate to these other countries? Those are some of the questions that interest me. But I think we have to congratulate Peter Wang and his team, all the three clubs, the kind of preparation that they've done for this, and the combination of great ground up publicity plus pizza. It's a great combination. Drawing a crowd in an interesting discussion. So I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wendy, I want to turn to you for not for the Canada viewpoint, but for a Canada perspective, particularly on how Canada thinks about, writes about its Arctic policy, its Arctic foreign policy, which it recently revamped. I often am wary of assigning government policy documents to my students because they tend to be dreadfully boring and highly opaque, right? However, if you take a policy document and ask yourself, what are the assumptions and what are the implicit priorities, you can sometimes get a clearer picture of what this document's meant to do. So if you could help us understand some of those assumptions that Canada brings to the environment that it's looking at, and some of the priorities, implicit or explicit, that it brings to its responses, that'd be a great starting point for our discussion.
Well, thanks, Joshua. Yeah, happy to do that. Thanks, Peter, and to the other organizers as well for pulling together this panel. Really exciting to be here. So last December, Canada released a Canadian Arctic foreign policy. This didn't replace previous policy statements we'd made in a typical Canadian way. It added to it or refreshed it, so brought it up to date. Obviously, a lot had changed since Canada released our Arctic and Northern Policy Framework back in 2019, not the least Russia's brutal, illegal, unprovoked invasion, further invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Yes, I have no problem saying that avowedly, even though that might be out of fashion in some circles these days. What does this mean? Through the voice of Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Melanie Joly, in writing a foreword to our Arctic foreign policy, said, for many years, Canada's aimed to manage the Arctic and northern regions cooperatively with other states as a zone of low tension that is free from military competition. However, the guardrails that we have depended on to prevent and resolve conflict have weakened. Russia's illegal war in Ukraine has made cooperation with it on Arctic issues exceedingly difficult for the foreseeable future. Uncertainty and unpredictability, thanks, Kent, are creating economic consequences that Canadians are facing every day. So think about Canada's Arctic foreign policy in light of our conversation today, also nesting or interacting within our Indo-Pacific strategy that was released in 2022. I'd say in some respects that document is a little more vague than our Arctic foreign policy, but it speaks to certain core themes. So, policy statement. And again, like parsing these words as we do as good analysts. Canada's desired end state, stable, prosperous, secure Arctic. Sounds a lot like US strategic documents. We haven't seen anything since January, but everything up to that point in time. Advancing the interests and priorities of Indigenous peoples and Northerners who call the Arctic home. To understand the Arctic through a Canadian lens, you have to understand the internal domestic politics around the primacy of Northern peoples, particularly Indigenous peoples, in agenda setting. The spirit of nothing about us without us, a phrase that actually came out of South Africa as part of their reconciliation efforts, was articulated by Northern leaders in Canada and has now become Greenland's mantra at the same time. So we can look and suggest to what extent is this new? And I'll take us back to the Conservatives. So the latest came out under a Liberal government. The Conservatives in 2010 talked about setting a vision for the Arctic as a stable, rules-based region with clearly defined boundaries, dynamic economic growth and trade, vibrant northern communities, and healthy and productive ecosystems. Why do I bring that up? Because it sounds very similar. There's more continuity than change, which is what I'm going to get at here. So rather than representing a fundamental change in how we look at the Arctic, as the Liberals suggested their policy was, I'd say it's a pretty logical continuation of what we've been doing since the 1990s. And Jim, you might have some reflections on that as well. So 3 core areas, nothing surprising from a Canadian standpoint: asserting Canada's sovereignty, emphasize sovereignty as an independent nation on the world stage, which every public opinion shows the vast, overwhelming majority of Canadians desire going forward. Advancing our interests in the region, so it's interest-based as well as values, and promoting a stable, prosperous, secure North. So this also aligns with pragmatic diplomacy, which I think will be a theme that we'll touch on later, which has been articulated by our current Minister of Foreign Affairs over the last few years. But at the same time, when you read our Arctic foreign policy, it's pretty clear that we are firmly in the NATO-US Western Democratic camp. And there's no question in this document who Canada considers to be its core Arctic allies. It's the United States, it's Greenland, and the Nordic countries. But then partners amongst non-Arctic European and North Pacific states, with Japan and South Korea singled out for particular attention. So I've got a few minutes left. What's the same in this document? Emphasizing deep commitment to the full implementation of the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, which I'm not going to dive into, but says this is aligned with domestic priorities. So a domestic lens, domestic calculus overshadows everything that's going on in our foreign policy space with respect to the Arctic. Commitment to Arctic state primacy, that the Arctic states are best positioned and equipped to understand the region and its peoples, and upholding the rules-based international order. So this elaborates on commitment to ensuring that the maritime claims are addressed in a manner that is consistent with international law. We, of course, gesture to the legality of our position on the Northwest Passage as historic internal waters. This is speaking to continental shelves. I'm happy to go into as much detail as you would like on both of those issues going forward, but also to a promise to secure Canada's national interests and ensure stability and prosperity for Indigenous peoples. And I keep coming back to that because it's reiterated time and time again. So A lot of defense investments in the Arctic foreign policy, which is perhaps surprising in a foreign policy document. Largely, these are reiterating what had come out in Canada's defense policy update in April of 2024. When we talk Arctic defense and security, ask me questions about a framework that I've been working on for several years with colleagues about differentiating between threats through the Arctic, right, that emanate outside of the region, pass through it to strike at targets outside, versus threats to the Arctic, where the Arctic is being targeted, versus threats within the Arctic. If we're calibrating our analytical tools to look at that, it really changes the way we understand dynamics that are playing out and perhaps demystify some of what we're being bombarded for from political elites, spin masters, and in the popular media, which in my mind confuses the heck out of all of this and leads to some pretty sloppy analysis, even in some pretty distinguished circles. So how exactly Canada intends to deploy from its Arctic, given that we do not base expeditionary forces in the Arctic, different than the US, which is basing forces in Alaska who belong to what combatant command? Can anybody tell me? Based in US Northern Command, but part of Indo-Pacific Command, right? A dagger pointed at the heart of the Indo-Pacific, if the US needs to wield it, right? Means that we're quite different. What is it that we need to defend against? Is it threats through the Arctic to continental North America? Or is it people who are actually targeting the Canadian Arctic? I have my own take. We'll hear from others what they think. US, Canada's greatest ally, closest partner and ally in the Arctic, resonates with previous messaging about being premier partners. This is what Canadians very much desire because it emphasizes this is the essential to the maintenance of a secure, strong, well-defended North American homeland upon which our two nations' mutual prosperity depends. So let's think about whether those assumptions have changed or whether we literally, those of us who fashion ourselves classical realists, find that we are in a world that is now relentlessly constructivist with the administration Americans have brought into the White House, and whether or not this changes the way we look at what I think are objective national interests and vested interests in defending North America together. Still references to the Arctic Council as a preeminent forum for Arctic cooperation and climate change a central theme being described as the most pressing and most proximate threat to Canada's security in the Arctic. We can talk about what that means. Is climate change a driver of conflict in the Arctic region? Is it a force or threat multiplier in the region? How do we want to talk about that? What's changed? Russia is no longer a possible partner in Canadian foreign policy. There is no business as usual while it maintains its illegal war in Ukraine. But it's kind of opaque about the threat that Russia actually poses to the Canadian Arctic or in the Canadian Arctic, different than through the Canadian Arctic. China, referenced 19 times in the text, is positioned as a non-Arctic state competitor that, quote, can be expected to use all the tools at its disposal to advance its geopolitical interests, including in the Arctic. A lot of concern about dual use, research vessels and surveillance platforms, and malign economic influence. We might ask, is that primarily a defense mandate? Or do we often confuse defense and broader national security mandates on these things? It affects which agencies we're turning to, right, to provide solution sets. So suggests that the risks of military attack in the North American Arctic remain low, that the region is a geographic vector for traditional emerging weapon systems that threaten broader North American and transatlantic security. And we might even say that's not just kinetic systems, it's also below the threshold concerns, what we often refer to as hybrid, cyber, and so on. NATO is also much more prominent in Canada's Arctic foreign policy than it has been before. And there are links between North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD modernization, and NATO's deterrence and defense agenda by protecting the alliance's northern and western flanks. This is still remains to be defined. Those of you working on master's degrees or PhDs, please dig in and help to articulate what this space might look like. So what's new? Supporting science and research coordination initiatives with foreign policy considerations, that's not new. As related to research security and science in the Arctic, this is one of those interesting areas. How are we associating what's seen as positive science diplomacy, science exchanges, with now serving as a vector or instrument of risk? Recognizing the North Pacific through the Bering Strait as a key approach to the North American Arctic. Why do I say that's new? Canadians have typically had a North Atlantic bias in the way we view the world and access to our Arctic. It's the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom gap, that whole sort of mental maps we had from the Cold War that have always persisted since that time. But I think by broadening our aperture to look at North Pacific Arctic interconnectedness, we now have a connection in Canadian foreign policy to Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy and this idea of NATO's Western approaches, which in my mind is very exciting, because this opens up opportunities with respect to Asian allies and partners such as Japan and South Korea. So to wrap up, the Canadian Arctic foreign policy suggests the diplomatic initiatives in the Arctic foreign policy will complement all of our pre-announced national defense investments by better aligning Canada's strategic approaches and by strengthening its relationship with Arctic allies. So I think our Arctic foreign policy provides top cover for our defense policy update of last year, which again, I bring up because in an American context, it's like we're doing things backwards, right? You have your national security strategy, then you have your national defense strategy, then you have your subordinate regional strategies. Canada, we kind of do things in a weird way. When's the last time we had a foreign policy writ large? 2005, national security strategy, 2004. So we do things a little bit more, some might say ad hoc, but there's coherence to it. It's just expecting you to really dig in and look at it here. In the end, I think this is largely an incremental update, but a very important refresh, articulating our strategic vision in light of developments from February of 2022 to the end of 2024. And that's obviously a very deliberate debate, because critics of it will say that the authors failed to anticipate the magnitude of a Trump 2.0 administration on both Arctic affairs and Canada-US relations. My response is, if anybody had suggested that one or two of the things that we have witnessed since January were going to happen, if they brought this up 4 months ago, they would have been laughed out of this room. Instead, we faced a tsunami of things that we're all still trying to grapple with, and which I'm sure we'll deal with in other questions.
It's a fantastic scene setter. And it strikes me that so many people in this town grappling in the US context with the US Greenland dynamics such as they are would do well to think about this risk framework that you laid out. Are these risks to Greenland? Are these risks from Greenland? Are these risks by way of Greenland? And thinking about how to respond to some of the bizarre fear mongering that's associated with the rhetoric about that right now. Your last point about the North Pacific Arctic is a great segue to Jim to give us some insight into how this Arctic foreign policy intersects with the broader Indo-Pacific strategy and priorities as they've evolved. And this will get us closer and closer to the questions of Japan and Korea. But if you could set that in the wider framework for us, that'd be great.
Delighted to do so. First, before I begin, let me congratulate each and every one of you in this room. Not only was it, as Dr. Calder has suggested, pizza, but this is a rare opportunity to, in fact, interact with an array, and I'm not speaking immodestly, of international experts on this theme. And the future lies with you. I'm very, very serious. That's not a cliche. It's vitally important to develop an entire strata of people deeply informed and articulate about global security concerns, of which this is a critical element. Secondly, let me paint a word picture for you. Not so far away from here is McLean, Virginia. 50,000 people. Okay, imagine an area the size of the lower 48. And then we're going to take those 50,000 people, multiply them by 2 and a bit, and sprinkle them over that area of the lower 48. One of the largest communities is going to be about 7,500 people, perhaps in Oregon, or perhaps it's in Florida. The reason I'm saying this is because it's vitally important for you to think about the reality of the Canadian North. It is an area the size of the lower 48. It has a population of about, some would say 115,000, some would say perhaps as many as 150,000. In penny packets, A few thousand here, a few thousand there, and that's it. It's vast, it's austere, it's beautiful, it's lethal, it's deadly, it eats people who aren't prepared. And it is enormously expensive as an arena in which to do development. So this is part of the background to my further comments. Thirdly, I would suggest that there is a strange sort of mystical quality about the Arctic. Everyone in Canada thinks the Arctic is fantastic. They'd lay down their life for the Arctic. Anyone who suggests that Arctic sovereignty is being infringed, oh no, all Canadians rise in righteous indignation. And yet 99.9% of them have never been there. And the moment that you begin to talk about how much it costs to actually defend the Arctic in conventional terms, then the ardor wanes dramatically. So we have this powerful resonance within the Canadian soul, a deep emotional commitment to the Arctic and the maintenance of Canadian sovereignty, and yet an abject, a criminal failure on the part of successive governments to, in fact, actually do anything. We have a well-refined and polished announcement culture in Ottawa, but no action. Let me give you one quick example. In August of 2007, I stood in the bright sunshine on the west coast of Canada. 15 feet away was the Prime Minister announcing grandly that the Royal Canadian Navy was going to develop an austere refueling station in the Arctic, because that's a reality of the Arctic. Colossal distances. You leave from Vancouver or Victoria on the west coast of Canada, you can go 4,500 miles before you even reach the western frontier of the Canadian Arctic on the Alaska border. So you need to have a capacity to refuel. So they were going to develop this port on the northwest flank of Baffin Island, which is a very significant piece of real estate in the northeastern part of the Arctic. Well, here we are 18 years later, and the project is still not finished. So we could go on enumerating this long catalog of issues where the Canadians have said, oh, we really have to do something. And quick as a flash, nothing happens. Because the costs are probably 8 or 10 times as great to build infrastructure in the Arctic as they are in the area close to the American border. And there's a subset lost sight of in the background noise of Gaza, and the Ukraine, and Russia, and El Salvador, and so on, is that funny thing called climate change. Reference was made to that. And what's deeply, deeply frightening is that we've now reached the point of feedback loops that are moving faster and faster. And it's not just at sea that the ice is melting, it's melting ashore. Permafrost. Arctic experts would reckon that it probably would cost $1 trillion to reinforce the infrastructures, whether it's railways or roads or airports and port facilities such as they are, which are virtually non-existent in the Arctic, Canadian Arctic, between now and the middle of the century. So that's a reality for the tiny communities scattered across the region. Now, Dr. White asked me a question, or posed the question about what is the connection between what's going on in the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific strategy? Well, there's a little bit of a sidebar here. For the longest time in Canada, we had a sort of curious love affair with China. Canadians long ago were active in China in missionary roles. And the children of those missionaries, so-called Mish kids, became in fact the first generation of Canadian ambassadors to China. And there was a powerful China lobby in parts of the Canadian political culture, mainly attached to the Liberal Party. But that relationship between Canada and China has been up and down, to say the least. And of course, Some of you may remember back in December of 2018, the arrest of Madame Meng, who was the chief financial officer of Huawei, the electronics firm, and she was arrested in Vancouver Airport at the request of the American authorities who wanted her extradited here. And this led in turn to a tit for tat arrest of two Canadians, the two Michaels, friends of mine, who spent more than 1,000 days in their prison cells in China before being released. So the relationship has gone up and down with China. I say that only by way of broad background that we've tended to ignore two really critical elements, and that's Japan and South Korea, which are, of course, the subject of this discussion this morning. Two quick comments to make. One is that Japan has begun to come of age. The Hiroshima generation, for better or for worse, is departing the scene. And now what we're seeing is a Japan increasingly anxious and concerned about the deteriorating security environment in Asia, and it's beginning to take on a role of security provider, of armaments maker, and so forth. Next door, we have, of course, the unfinished business of the Cold War in the divided Korean Peninsula. And what makes things doubly difficult now, of course, is the burgeoning relationship between Kim Fatty and in Pyongyang and Putin. The relationship between Russia and North Korea as a result of the exigencies of the Ukrainian war. So we have an increasingly dynamic situation in Northeast Asia. Now, all that, and I'm going to cut for a moment to November of 2022 on a exposed waterfront in Vancouver in Western Canada. There is the Prime Minister, Trudeau, there is Melanie Joly, the Foreign Minister, and one or two other worthies, and they're announcing the Indo-Pacific strategy. Subsequently, I wrote a critique of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I said that it was ambitious, aspirational, and 40 years late. Because trade across the Pacific exceeded trade across the Atlantic in 1983. And here we are, 39 years later, articulating a foreign policy with respect to the Pacific. It is a profoundly domestic foreign policy statement. If you do a detailed analysis, as I did, of the people who participate in the production of the Indo-Pacific strategy, you'll find that only 2 or 3 of them actually know anything about the Pacific at all. All the rest are either indigenous entrepreneurs or female empowerment activists. And that's written broadly into the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, that may be overly cynical, but it's a point of contact, nevertheless, for the high emphasis in the Canadian Arctic on indigenous activities. And I suppose we can argue that that resonates certainly in Taiwan with the indigenous community and with indigenous residents in Hokkaido in northern Japan. So the Indo-Pacific strategy, the main thrust of it was that Canada had been asleep at the switch. It was a nation of sleepwalkers. All these years have gone by, and everyone in the Pacific said, oh, the Canadians, they're great people, but they're never here. So what the Indo-Pacific strategy said was we're going to focus on Southeast Asia because it's a collection of small, moderate-sized economies, and we're going to put $5 billion into 5 years to try to increase Canada's brand. One of the problems in Canada, ladies and gentlemen, is that we come up with money, never enough, and we always say that it's going to be effective in 2032 or 2045. So it's not enough money to make up for our personnel deficit over the years. We're making some moves, but not nearly enough. And the focus is not so much on the Arctic, obviously, but as suggested in the earlier comments, what's happening is that South Korea and Japan are becoming increasingly independent-minded and active, not to mention uncertain as to the degree of support they'll enjoy from Washington. They're increasingly concerned about China, Russia, military and naval operations in the Bering Sea approaches to the Arctic. They're increasingly concerned about the maritime potential of the Arctic in terms of shipbuilding, the production of icebreakers, transportation of energy and supplies across the Northern Sea route, as Dr. Calder had suggested, and then into the Canadian Arctic. There's an accident of geography, and I'll wrap this up in the next 60 seconds, that if you look at the Canadian Arctic, the spin of the Earth causes the ice that's begun to break up in the spring to migrate into the very part of the north, which is often talked about, the Northwest Passage, which is Canadian waters. So by the very nature of things, the Northern Sea route along the Russian coast will be open first for commercial traffic, and Putin has highly ambitious objectives, but they still pale into insignificance compared with the Suez route, despite what's happening with the Houthis right now. So another issue which is critical, and that's fish. Not very sexy, but fish are colossally important. If you look at world fish stocks, about 70% of them are at or beyond their carrying capacity. And with climate change, fish are moving north. They know a good thing when they see it, and it's in the Arctic. And so that's another area of intersection between what's happening for Chinese, or rather for Japan and South Korean fishers, and what's eventually going to begin unfolding in the Canadian Arctic. So there's yet one further comment, and that's that picked in the seat of the pants as we've been, and we deserved it, by our tangerine friend down here. We have committed ourselves to getting 12 submarines. Where are the 12 submarines going to come from? I do not have any inside information, but I would lay dollars for donuts or pizza that it's going to come from South Korea. And if that's the case, then the logistical and maintenance relationship between Canada, Royal Canadian Navy in Canada, and South Korea is going to become more and more intense. The Indo-Pacific strategy already commits the Canadian Navy to have a greater presence in the region, and I think this will be further reinforced if we go down the submarine route. The submarines are, by the time they're delivered, there'll probably be enough open water in the Arctic that they might actually be able to use conventional submarines in the north, but that's another issue. Thanks very much.
Prentice, thank you. Turning last, but certainly not least, to Elizabeth for a view from Japan and Korea's interests. And I think we've all watched over the last decade, both Japan and Korea in their own ways become more interested in their regional engagements, Philippines, new Southern policy with Korea and other things. But looking toward the Arctic, give us a sense of how they see incentives and opportunities. And feel free to bring some of that fresh analytic cynicism that we heard to their calculations as well, in understanding what's in it for them at this moment and over a longer horizon.
Thank you for those questions, and thank you to the organizers who really did a fantastic job, with or without pizza, to get a capacity crowd for this event. It's my pleasure to be with all of you. We've heard a lot of interesting comments so far, so I want to set a little bit of context before I answer those questions. So I came to this subject as someone who studies mostly China and Russia and their relationship. I came to this topic via a project for the East-West Center a couple of years ago, where I was looking at how the US might engage with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and India in the Arctic, in the North Pacific Arctic. So why those countries? So there had been so much attention on China as an observer state in the Arctic Council since 2013. But China's not the only Asian observer state in the Arctic Council. At the same time, those four countries, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and India also joined, but we never talked about them. So I was very curious, what did they actually want from the Arctic? Singapore being almost near the equator. Why was Singapore so interested? How about India? That also was geographically unlikely. And China claims it's a near Arctic state, despite being nowhere near the Arctic. Japan is probably the closest geographically. So that's how I began looking. And to my great surprise, one factor stood out in their interest in the Arctic, and that was their relationship with Russia. I was not anticipating that at all. And I think that's an important part of the answer to the questions. How do they see the Arctic? When you look from the point of view of Indo-Pacific states, the gateway to the Arctic is through the Northern Sea route, which goes above the Russian coastline. That makes Russia the gatekeeper to the Arctic. And that's true for China too, I would add. Although China's economy is 10 times bigger than Russia's, this is the only place in the world where China cannot operate independently. It depends on its relationship with Russia to participate in the Arctic. And China had been trying for a long time to engage with Russia in the Arctic and was not getting anywhere for many years. Russia, along with Canada, I would say, was one of the main skeptics about China's participation as an observer in the Arctic Council. It was only in 2013, so before the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, that Russia began accepting some Chinese investment in the Russian Arctic. So it was kind of a hard sell for Russia, which already had a strategic partnership with China since 1996. But for Russia, the Arctic is very much part of its identity. It has the longest Arctic coastline. This area is very important for Russian military security and for Russian economic security. And Russia was wary of bringing in outsiders into the region. And so we need to keep this in mind, that even though China's so much stronger economically and Russia's under pressure because of sanctions, China still depends on Russia to get into the Arctic region, as do Japan, South Korea, and I will also add India and Singapore, just not to leave them out. So the Russia-China partnership is a topic I've explored for many years, and there are many contradictory aspects about it that I just want to mention briefly to set some context. So I believe they are deepening their alignment. We have seen a lot more activity, especially around the North Pacific Arctic. We've seen strategic bomber exercises. We've seen maritime exercises by navies and coast guards. We've seen the Chinese Coast Guard, which is part of under the Central Military Commission, engage with the Russian Coast Guard, which is under the FSB, which means that it's very tightly connected to Putin, their Ministry of Public Security. So we have seen this deepening alignment. China has been the largest supplier of dual-use technologies to Russia's war in Ukraine, has been very important to the Russian economy. The two leaders, Xi and Putin, see a strong political need to mutually support one another. Despite having an unlimited term in office, they're both politically very insecure. And so they need each other for that national security, political security. But despite that, Russia has long feared being dependent on China, is becoming a resource appendage to China. And those transits across the Northern Sea route, mostly to China, of resources, really capture that fear that Russia does not want to be in that position. And so Russia has been eager to engage with other countries to reduce its reliance on China economically. And we've seen Japan and South Korea prior to the 2022 war be of interest to Russia in the Arctic. Also, since the war, a host of other countries, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, India, and others. So Russia, in its foreign policy concept and its Arctic concept, now identifies friendly countries and unfriendly countries. So before China, Russia was mostly focused on engaging within the Arctic institutions, and now it's interested in engaging with countries that are going to be friendly. So there's talk about a BRICS science station in Svalbard, and bringing in a lot of out-of-region countries that previously Russia would have been opposed to. So getting back to Japan and South Korea. So for Japan and South Korea, they saw the Russian Northern Sea route as their ticket to becoming more involved in the Arctic. And this depended on their relationship with Russia. And so they shared certain goals, but they also have certain differences in the way they approach Russia, which I'll get into in a moment. So they wanted to engage with Russia, and they are also very concerned about this deepening China-Russia partnership that has been described by all the other panelists. And so they saw, I'm going to argue mistakenly, that by engaging with Russia in the Arctic, they could somehow attenuate this partnership between China and Russia and reduce the competition that they each felt with China in the Arctic and have more opportunities for themselves. I think that's all mistaken idea that these countries have. And they were mostly focusing on shipping and energy, and I would agree also fishing would be another one here to improve their position in competition. So we see Japan and South Korea cooperating with other countries, other Arctic states plus China in the Central Arctic Fisheries Agreement. This would be to regulate fisheries in this what's known as the donut hole in the Arctic. So you have the area above Russia, the Northern Sea route, but beyond that zone, you have the Central Arctic Ocean, which is not navigable at present, but could be. And so the idea is to forestall a mad rush for those hardy fish that are swimming north and to regulate that competition. But China, I think, is looking, and probably the other countries too, are looking for that day when it's navigable, because then no one would need Russia's say-so or icebreakers or to pay fees or to do any of those things. They could just independently navigate there. But we're not there yet. And in fact, the Northern Sea route isn't very navigable yet either. It's true, the ice is melting, but it's not a great place to navigate if you're in container shipment because the ice is unpredictable. There's still ice there, and you need on-time shipping if you have container ships. It's appropriate for bulk shipping of minerals, of oil, and so forth, but not yet for these containers. And in fact, if you look at the distance, like from China, it depends where you are in China, whether it saves you time. The northern Chinese provinces are really interested because some of them are landlocked, and for them, it's closer than Suez. But if you're in Shanghai or Guangzhou or Hong Kong, it's not closer to you. Suez is still better. So there is this idea that that through agreements, Japan and South Korea would be able to be participants in the future of the Arctic. They also joined the Northern Coast Guard Forum, so they can participate in Arctic governance along with China and the other Arctic states. So these are areas where they have shared ideas about Arctic governance, about use of the Northern Sea route for energy shipping and fisheries and also their concern with the China-Russia partnership. However, there are some differences that I want to highlight too. So for Japan, there's been this idea that engaging with Russia would solve a lot of problems. One would be energy, because Japan is reliant on energy imports, especially after the Fukushima disaster, where nuclear power was taken offline largely. So they used to import about 10% of LNG from Russia. And so this was seen as having two benefits. One was for energy security, and the other was to engage with Russia so that potentially there's some solution to the islands issue, the Northern Territories issue with Russia. Some energy experts in Japan think that this was a stupid idea to invest in Russian energy because there's a very problematic sector subject to nationalization and Putin's whims. And hopes for returning the islands, I think, ended in the early 90s. So China managed to get the border demarcated with Russia. That was 1991. I think for Japan, it was over by 1993. And so this is an impossible dream. Russia is always dangling this as a way of getting Japanese investment. They also have their unrealistic ideas. If only Japan would invest in the Russian Far East, kind of would be a paradise and everything would be great. But that's not happening either because Japanese businesses are looking at the economics of it and the risk, and the first is bad and the second is high. So that's not going to happen. So Japan has been interested, in addition to energy, also in developing Arctic science and the sustainable development of the Arctic, and has been developing a lot of technologies that are connected to this. South Korea also has been looking to Russia for different reasons, and that's because of the Korean Peninsula issue. Russia has long had connection to North Korea. Now they have a strategic partnership, which North Koreans call an alliance. They have a mutual defense clause in this alliance, and North Korean soldiers, 13,000 of them are fighting in Russia on behalf of Russian war in Ukraine. So this issue has also been a feature of why South Korea engages with Russia, including in the Arctic. And so they were developing the tankers that would service the Russian Northern Sea route, and especially the LNG projects. And South Korea received 9% of its fossil fuels from Russia prior to the war in Ukraine. Last year, they cut their deliveries by a lot. They eliminated oil and naphtha deliveries. They still get some coal and gas, apparently. So South Korea was hoping to leverage its engagement in the Russian Arctic to support its shipbuilding industries, its energy needs, but also for this political aim of achieving Russian support for some solution on the Korean Peninsula. I think in general, areas where South Korea can contribute are also in science, shipping, shipbuilding, and port development. And I think we'll get later to how Canada can engage with Japan and South Korea. I think there are a lot of opportunities to engage with these countries, as well as with India and Singapore, I would say.
Terrific. That's a great perspective on, it sort of goes back to the sort of geopolitical points that began with in an important way. I have one big question for all of you, and then we'll open up to Q&A in the interest of time. And it centers on the word that's the title of this event, which is cooperation. This is a frequently overused word in this town and in national capitals across the world. Sometimes it means something as paltry as deconfliction. Sometimes it means recognizing some alignment of interests and doing things in parallel. Sometimes it means active collaboration with respect to projects. And sometimes it means, at the highest level, institutionalizing or formalizing organizations or bodies that can do things together. And we use this word in all these different ways. But I want to ask, in this context, if you could speak to what you think the art of the possible is, and in practicality, but also in politics. I mean, anybody who's looked at Japan-Korea cooperation knows that it requires an alignment of the political stars at just the right moment, in just the right way for things to happen. There's very dynamic politics in all three of these countries. If each of you could speak to the art of the possible and what, on that sliding scale of cooperation, what do you think is realistic as we look maybe over the next 10 years in this relationship?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick us off here. I think, first of all predicated on reinforcing shared democratic values, longstanding security partnerships. This is not new, something that's being built. Trade and investment. We've heard energy, LNG. Canada's got its own discussions to have about whether we're prepared to lean in on what is our bounty of natural gas that could be exported, mineral fuels, oils, things that are really important to Japan, emerging green tech. This is the green sustainable future that's articulated by all three of our nations. Respect for international law, UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. These are big shared interests that we all have, tremendous international legal capacity in all of our countries. Resilience to climate-related disasters, building that up. Thanks to all those South Korean firefighters who came over to Canada during our unprecedented wildland fire season in 2023, directly relating to climate change. So all strong allies in supporting the rules-based multilateral system, and all of us being committed to that, but also practical pieces. Supply chain resilience. How do we counter economic coercion, non-market practices? Again, behooves us to tighten up things. We've already spoke to fighting illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, that Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. Thanks to Japan for hosting the data that's coming in from that to determine when, if in the future, it is sustainable to have those fish stocks that will proceed. Vested interest here. Defense. So here's a big one. I'm going to focus a lot on Korea. 2023, 10-year memorandum of understanding on defense, R&D testing, evaluation, prototyping, information sharing, exchanges between scientists and engineers, annual joint meetings on materiel, airborne anti-submarine warfare, enhanced maritime domain awareness, and submarines. This is big stuff. Jim referred, generally to talk of Canada's $60 billion Canadian Patrol Submarine Project program, seeking those 12 conventionally powered subs. Seems like the front runner, if you're looking at Canadian media, is Daewoo Shipbuilding and Engineering's KSS-3 or Jang Bogo 3. So an off-the-shelf option, if we are going to meet our 6-year timeline to get that first vessel in the water, this may be the best option. Highly capable, quiet, diesel electric, even has vertical launch things where you can have a certain configuration of ballistic missile with a 1,500 kilometer range. Ask me technical details if you want later. I just pulled them offline, but I'll try my best. And we have Hanwha Ocean teaming up with various Canadian companies like CAE and Gas Stops to pursue this contract. So a very live, very current, and again, not prejudicing a procurement process because I have no say in it, but very exciting possibility. And then coming back to comments, the other people have talked about the Japanese Taige class sub, the lithium ion battery powered, I think it is. One, from what I heard November of last year, they actually withdrew their decision to bid, but I may be outdated in my information there. Other piece though here is science, and several people have brought it up. Canada's invested in a Canadian Higher Tech Research Station in Cambridge Bay, invites the world to partner with us on science there. Marine scientific research, lots of capacity on the part of Japan and Korea. Canada, again, welcomes partnering, especially with like-minded nations like ourselves, and also new configurations like the Center of Excellence on Climate and Security that's being built up under the auspices of NATO, but in Montreal, great opportunities here to actually clarify the linkages between climate change and security, which I said before, again, we often confuse drivers and mistake drivers, particularly in an Arctic context. Great opportunities for us to work together and clarify a lot of our associations or correlations that we have. And we've heard here even complications between accessibility. Too much of the rhetoric out there suggests the Arctic is opening up. It's opening up in one particular domain, the surface, in a very narrow window of time. The Arctic is not opening up. Our maps that fill it all with blue confuse us. And you brought up, Jim, permafrost. What's the worst time of year to operate in the Arctic? The shoulder seasons, the spring and fall. And the summer is really difficult for land forces, for example, to operate. The Arctic is not becoming inherently more accessible evenly across the Arctic. We got to really get more precise in our analytics, and especially as academics, as thinkers, as influencers, we can help to correct a lot of the misinformation that's flowing out there that is distorting our appraisal of what's happening according to what timelines.
That's great. And I think you know, a number of these things you highlighted are bilateral between Canada and Japan, or Canada and Korea, but they're reinforcing with a broader trilateral approach. That's telling. Same question, open to any of you, and this you want to take an angle on it.
Well, a couple of quick observations, if I may, Dr. White. Rule of law. If we go back to July of 2016, what we see is the International Court of Arbitration in Den Haag bringing down a ruling with respect to the legitimacy of Chinese claims in the South China Sea. They suggested, and they were absolutely unvarnished in their assessment, that Chinese claims were completely bogus. Chinese simply ignored the ruling and have gone on in their carborundum way, trying to wear down the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, and others in terms of China's primacy in the South China Sea. Now, if we swing around and go to the Arctic, what we see is that the Chinese are putting their hand on their heart and saying, oh, we'll observe every element of the international conventional law of the sea. Now, whether you would trust them as far as you could throw them is another issue altogether, but this is where the rubber hits the road. Do we, in fact, actually have a set of circumstances through the Arctic Council, if it's reanimated, or other vehicles, to ensure that the law of the sea is actually observed properly? Secondly, the environment. Many of the cargoes in the Arctic are, in fact, deeply toxic to the environment. If there was an oil or gasoline spill in the Arctic, and the distances, again, as I suggested earlier, are colossal. You have to fly 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 miles to get from bases in the southern part of Canada to the high Arctic, and our capacity to deal, to assess and to deal with oil spills is close to zero. Simply because, again, the distances and the scale, you need a lot of assets, and we simply do not have them. 3, we have ships. We have Arctic and offshore patrol ships, but they are ships which are ice reinforced, so they will go through 1 meter of ice. That's new ice, but they have effectively no kinetic firepower. They have no helicopter, and they have no underwater capability to assess what's going on. So one of the huge deficits that we face in the Arctic is knowing what's going on beneath the ice. And it's one thing to know, and it's another thing to do something about it. One of the debates, of course, is an air-independent propulsion submarine, without getting into a lot of complex technological data, is an AIP submarine sufficient for dealing with underwater, under ice threats? Because most AIP submarines can't surface through the ice. That's another whole issue. Do we go down the nuclear road? Curiously enough, Canada has more nuclear capability than Australia, which has none. And yet the Australians have managed to ace us at the starting mark in terms of the nuclear submarine development programs in Australia. But that's an important sidebar issue. But that, again, will link us back, I think, willy-nilly, probably to South Korean providers. And there's the whole issue of maintenance and logistics and so on in terms of the submarines and in terms of Canadian naval operations in the Western Pacific that will rely increasingly on yards in Japan and South Korea. Thank you.
So what does cooperation mean? I think if we get back to the Canadian Arctic policy, which I also read, I think in the first or second paragraph, there's discussion of the Russian threat. And also the Chinese, the Russian threat today and perhaps a future Chinese challenge. As China's efforts in the Arctic really have not panned out for the most part so far. So addressing those challenges, I think requires some unity of action. And some of the ideas that we just heard from colleagues on this panel, I think are important. So Japan and South Korea are already in this Northern Coast Guard Forum. I think that's important in terms of dealing with potential oil spill mitigation, with search and rescue as economic activity increases. Also, bring in India in this area. India has been training with the Russians in terms of polar navigation. So if you want to reduce Russian influence, you have to replace it. So I think part of collaboration or cooperation is replacing the engagement with Russia with engaging with Canada. And you can do this with Japan, with South Korea, with India in this Coast Guard area. You can also avoid redundancies. So another thing I noticed in my project was that each of these 4 countries was building up its own satellite network for polar navigation. So wouldn't it be great if all of these countries and Canada and hopefully at the US once our dystopia has run its course, we could all collaborate in these technologies and have enhanced polar navigation, because the Chinese and the Russians are doing exactly this right now. Energy, I think, also would be another area where we could all collaborate in terms of LNG to try to permanently replace some of these amounts that Japan and South Korea are getting from the Russian Arctic, and also look at alternative energy. And there, Singapore has some very interesting ideas about the provision of remote energy that could be helpful to Canada with its goals of sustainably developing indigenous communities and so on. So I think those are some ideas to kind of do some substitution of effort for the Russian component and to avoid some redundancies while addressing some gaps.
Perfect. Very practical. Ken, can I ask you to weigh in on this briefly, and then because I have to scamper across the hall lest I get in trouble, I might ask Peter to come up and moderate a little Q&A for those of you who could stay. I know there's been so many things put on the table here, ideas, history, cooperation, forward-looking ideas that I know some of you will have questions. So if I could ask you, Ken, for
Yeah, just very, very briefly. I must say, I found this to be fascinating. I've learned a lot. I think we've summarized most of the key issues. Sort of what remains in my mind, particularly, is the issue of critical uncertainties. It's predictable that we're going to have global warming. We've had differences to tell. How open is the north on the seas? I would say it's certainly more open than it is on the land. The permafrost issue was interesting to me on the land. There's a lot of complexities that global warming will create, but the oceans maybe will be more open. In the relationship of the Indo-Pacific or the North Pacific, really, Indian Ocean is not so related to this, and the Arctic and the countries in question. I was quite struck by several of the things that Jim talked about, and particularly that brings the issue of the critical uncertainties, particularly one that's hanging over Northeast Asia in the light of the way that the Ukraine crisis and war has evolved. Namely, if we were to get a conflict of some sort in Northeast Asia, either relating to the Korean Peninsula or conceivably the Taiwan Straits, or the interactions that might even produce a nuclear dimension in some of this, the kind of uncertain world that Jim was speaking to. You know, what does that mean in terms of the coordination of these countries on security issues? In the case of a protracted conflict of some sort, maintenance and logistics, resupply and repair, coordinated deployments. Those aren't issues that we want to think about too much, but looming in the shadows are those security questions, in addition to the more cooperative security questions like, say, energy security and so on, or energy development, or LNG, or pipelines, or those kind of things. So there are a tremendous agenda of issues out there. And at least I think all of us agree and hope, well, we hope that we can move toward a deeper coordination among the questions involved, with one big critical uncertainty, of course, out there as well. Enough said on that.
Enough said.
So,
Would you like to come in and moderate? I have to beg leave, unfortunately. I will miss all your polite, tough, concise questions that are questions. But I've enjoyed this, and please do stay if you can.
All right, so I'll be moderating some parts of the student questions, and since I'm a student, I'm gonna probably start one of my own. So, you know, we have the Canadian speakers in our room. Relations between our two countries are very much shaky. Today at 4 p.m. Still gonna wait. I'm gonna probably watch the announcement coming from the Rose Garden live. This is, as Professor Calder mentioned, Liberation Day, and we don't know. We don't know what's gonna happen when it comes to tariffs. So, the question I have for this panel is Trump 2.0. And to really turn to Canadian experts, how is Ottawa thinking about this strategically? Our new Prime Minister has made some comments, but what does this really mean for continental defense, for our cooperation in the Arctic? And for Japan and South Korea, how are you thinking about this as well in terms of how to navigate the Trump administration? But in terms of just like trilateral cooperation as a multilateral, whether in the Arctic and Pacific, is that possible without the United States as the keynote?
Well, I'm just wondering whether they're making my cell ready at El Salvador or not before I make my comments. I must say that we're genuinely concerned not only about the vindictiveness and uncertainty of presidential policies, but the lamentable caliber of so many of his cabinet officials in terms of the execution of policy. That by way of a broad background comment on the nature of the relationship between Ottawa and Washington. With respect to defense, Trump is absolutely right. We have been laggards. The first responsibility of any government is to provide adequate defense and security for its citizenry, and we have failed to do this. And not only have we failed to do this, but we have failed to do this for so long that in fact there are those who are well informed who are deeply pessimistic about our ability to ever in fact revitalize the Canadian Armed Forces to a degree. I could cite eye-watering examples of the inadequacy of the Canadian Forces. I'll leave that for the moment. So we do need, quite apart from the theater of the 2% commitment, and we did indeed commit ourselves to 2% according to the NATO formula, and we failed abjectly to honor that commitment. We do need to proceed with, in fact, addressing the structural shortcomings which affect equipment, affect personnel, affect training, affect facilities, and so forth. Now, within that context, there is, of course, a larger institutional commitment. That is to say that Canada and the United States are joined at the hip with the NORAD agreement. And that, of course, brings us back to the Arctic in the sense that one of the things that the recently appointed Prime Minister Carney has decided in Canada is that Canada will spend just under $5 billion to establish an over-the-horizon radar, which in fact he's acquiring or planning to acquire from Australia. Australians have had one in place in Northern Australia for many, many years indeed, looking towards Indonesia and the South China Sea. So we do have a commitment, but we have, for example, 16 F-35s, which we purchased, and we have a further 72, which we're committed to, but suddenly we've begun to wobble because somebody somewhere said, well, can we ever trust the president again? Most of the equipment in the F-35, most of it, not all of it by any means, some of it comes from Canada, but most of it comes from the United States. Will he, in a moment of vindictiveness, decide that he's going to paralyze the entire Canadian Armed Forces, such as it is, by simply throwing the so-called kill switch? Well, Lockheed Martin and others assure us there is no kill switch, but the same applies with the new generation of Canadian warships that are being built, which have a high level of American content. And that is absolutely understandable. We want interoperability. But what will happen downstream during the Trump presidency? And this is only Trump 2.0. At the present rate, he's talking about Trump 3.0, which will be a complete, absolute, utter disaster. We're in a state of near paralysis in terms of what is the way forward, because changing horses in midstream now and getting another fighter jet just doesn't make any sense at all, particularly in terms of the widespread adoption of F-35s by other air forces around the world. So I'll leave. I'll leave.
Yeah.
And we're gonna have fun here because I disagree with just about everything Jim has just said. First of all, I think that it's almost. I'm going to use the word.
I sent him unmarked envelopes with cash, and he disagrees.
To me, it's fundamentally unhelpful to have these kind of narratives talking about our failures, because this is exactly what the Trump White House is feeding as misinformation and disinformation out there. So I couldn't disagree more. We have pulled our weight. You know, who was at the helm in 9/11? Who has been a trustworthy ally for the US? Who could ask for a better neighbor than Canada? And I put that out to all of you. Do we have a need to make investments going forward? Has the world shifted? Has Canada made commitments? Does it take some time? Yes, we are not in paralysis. The Canadian government announced over the horizon radar, and within 2 years has committed to going and partnering with Australia to deliver this. When have we ever delivered a massive capital program? Never mind a $6 billion one in the span of 2 years. Quite the opposite. I think we're finding ourselves working towards agility and realizing to operate at the speed of relevance, we need to do things a little differently. But make no mistake, we have been a very credible ally. We're doing our part. We have Operation Reassurance in Ukraine. We have been the reliable ally and partner within NATO. No one is questioning our sincerity there. Yes, we need to work towards 2%. On that point, I agree. But I don't think it requires us throwing Canada under the bus and saying that historically we have been unreliable or unethical in our approach. Threat environments change. We think about our briefing notes, right? Those first stat periods we're talking about assumptions and constraints. Those are requiring a fundamental reappraisal. It doesn't require us throwing ourselves under the bus. And Canadians, we love to self-flagellate. We love to criticize ourselves. I struggle because I spent the last 25 years of my career trying to correct what I saw as a wrong narrative of the US as a threat to Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic. This narrative arc that started during the Reagan administration around free trade and worries about the US, and trying systematically to show that this has not been the case. We've actually responded as attentive allies and friends who can agree to disagree on some pretty fundamental things, but still remain the most trusted of partners. And it's troubling Because here we've had the United States going from being a premier partner in the last few months to an explicit threat to Canadian sovereignty. Make no mistake about it. An administration talking about making us a 51st state, about crushing our economy to coerce us into folding into the US is an existential threat. Is it just verbiage? Is it just bombast? Right? Think about what a threat is. Capability plus intent. Intent is being expressed in this case. Capability, willingness to go forward. I hope, my operative word, hope that your commander-in-chief, for those of you who are Americans, is not sincere on this. But this is alarming. Reality is we are strategic partners in the defense of North America. Trump has chosen to frame the US as a competitor, even threat to Canada and Greenland, right? Another sovereign actor within the Kingdom of Denmark. A lot of this is framed around overblown rhetoric about Arctic resources. Remember, the most efficient way for Americans to get access to critical minerals in places like Greenland and the Canadian Arctic, to have stable, friendly value chains, is through partnership, respect for sovereignty, investment. Full stop.
There's a States. What's changed is not Whitney has suggested a profound tsunami in terms of, but for the first time, we're now seeing a profound anxiety in the Pentagon as to the capacity of the United States Navy, for example, to execute its responsibilities in the Western Pacific. Whereas that was always taken as read before and reinforced the sort of subconscious reliance on the Canadian part, on an American partner. This can no longer be taken as read.
Professor Wishner, Professor Calder, any views?
Yeah, I guess I would, I listened with a lot of interest. I see that we have some agreement that Canada should move toward the 2% of GDP defense commitment that of course has been general across NATO, and now about 2/3 of the nations in NATO have reached that level. So I'm happy to hear that. I agree with what was said about the problem of capabilities. And I think that it is the case that if you take AUKUS, for example, some of the benchmarks regarding production, say, even the Virginia class submarines and so on, the schedule for production on the US side, has the United States been meeting targets? Is it capable of meeting targets? I think that's a serious issue that we have to confront. It's problems in the American shipbuilding industry. So what has been said and critique of sort of the US capabilities and so on, I think is common sense with what I'm doing. We're all better off with a much more positive two-way relationship. I think there's no question about this. In the first Trump administration, of course, Trump was beating on this issue on 2% of GDP. For a long time, only around 1/3 of the nations in the alliance had reached that level. Then there's been some response to this trigger. Does it need to take this sort of reductive? I have serious questions in that regard. But is some sort of representation, we have to move away from the moral hazard problem, I guess, is a natural one. The US has, because we have to play the insecurity on many dimensions. And if that's the case, there's a temptation of other partners, not not to share burdens equitably. There is that natural issue. But that said, this is not the way to deal with it as far as I'm concerned. So this is
It's like 1.2, what Whitney said, capabilities and intentions. So I don't know if we're hearing about intentions or just a lot of noise. So that it's a danger of mistaking one for the other in both directions. But before coming to this event, I was looking at how do the US and Canada actually work together in the Arctic? And we still engage together in Northcom, in NORAD, we have military exercises. So if you listen to, Fox News, we're having an economic war, but the reality on the ground is somewhat different. And I don't understand the purpose of these so-called liberating tariffs. I wish they were not happening, but I think that what we can do is to try to emphasize the areas where we collaborate and hope to deepen those areas and to maintain some trust despite all the alarming noises coming out.
If I can just build on, I just came back from in February, 3.5 weeks on the land in northern Northwest Territories and northern Yukon as part of Operation Nunavut. So deployed with Canadian Armed Forces and partners through programs like Ice Paper, collaborative international collaboration on science relating to defense research and development, showcasing certain technologies, a lot of American presence. I can tell you on the ground, the relationship is a very positive one. So again, I think framing things along the stories of how do we keep this out of the elite political level noise space, as I think a lot of us are talking about, and making sure that things are intact at the functional level, the better off we're going to be. And I think at that level thus far, we've been fairly well insulated. And I push some of you towards look at General Guillot, the commander of U.S. Northern Command NORAD, his testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, 13th of February, I think it was. You want to look at well-calibrated language that actually reflects the world as it is. I think it's right there, and gives us some reassurance.
Right. Well, in the interest of time, I think we're gonna do some rapid fire questions. So for those of you that have questions on the floor, we'll collect them collectively and have our experts answer them collectively as well. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll pass the mics along. Guess we did a good job. Anybody else? Just one? Oh, I saw you.
For your presence.
Just to follow up on that, what has been Canada's view on the martial law declaration by President Yoon? Do we still see South Korea as a trustworthy nation? Just to build on top of that spice things up.
I'll leave that to you, Jim. The easy question for you.
So I think you go with the first one.
There we go. So in terms of the potential, I think, or pardon me, the effective legal safeguard, it is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's the Constitution of the Oceans. It's continuing to also communicate that adherence with that. And I'm even going to give you Americans a freebie and say you treat it as customary international law. You've generally operated in compliance with it. This is positive, recognizing that for Arctic states, key partners and allies like Korea and Japan, we have vested interest in maintaining this as a solid foundation. It means that things like extended continental shelves do not keep me up at night thinking that these are flashpoints to see warfare emanating from Arctic disputes. Why? Because all of the Arctic coastal states have a vested interest in this unfolding according to international law in adherence, including Russia in this particular case. Unpredictable actor, revisionist, revanchist, yes, yes, yes. In the Arctic, I think it's pretty safe to say we all benefit from international law being a common foundation. This has been articulated from Ilulissat onward, and I don't see that changing. And from the United States, I think it's ensuring the messaging. You are actually very good at communicating and demonstrating that, say, when you have a Russian and Chinese naval or Coast Guard task force pass through the Aleutian Islands, which you see entering into the Bering Sea, and according to US models, is an Arctic issue. I keep saying that's about the same latitude as where Jim's from in Victoria or Esquimalt or Seattle. So it's still far of how Canadians typically associate their mental map of the Arctic. I'll say I'll be a little bit more nervous if those vessels are passing through the Bering Strait, into the Arctic Ocean. But at this particular moment, I keep saying the US does a really good job of not being trapped into taking stances that are undermining its own position on freedom of navigation and getting the right balance between being a maritime nation and a coastal state. So as long as we're all playing off the same playbook of the law of the sea, I think that this is something that should continue. China, particularly in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, will continue to manipulate this. Lawfare is very much present. We must be attentive to it, but I don't think overreact, and certainly not draw direct analogies between the Arctic and the legal regime in play there with that in the South China Sea, which is being brutally abused, as you suggested, Jim.
And a very quick footnote, I think one of the issues that we need to watch closely is China's use of coast guards in a paramilitary or military fashion. Whereas stereotypically, they're always used as a way of eliminating tensions or assisting mariners and so forth, but that's not the case with the Chinese Coast Guard.
I'll just add that one thing that is lacking in the Arctic is a mechanism to deal with international conflicts, because the Arctic Council is not set up for that. Right now, we see the spillover of the war in Ukraine into the Arctic, and we're not really set up to deal with that. Russia's out in terms of in-person meetings, and the other security-oriented bodies were NATO affiliated. All the other countries are NATO members. On the question of South Korea, it's a really interesting question, and I find myself having trouble answering it. If we have the continuation of the PPP party, the current party, let's say the president is impeached and we have the same party winning the election, I think that would be an easier transition to greater cooperation in the North Pacific, because you have already the example of trilateral cooperation, Japan, South Korea, and US. You have a similar appreciation of the Russian threat in Ukraine, the threat from North Korea acting out of the area, wariness about China, and so on. If you have the Democratic Party taking the presidency, then there are questions raised, because that party has more of an interest in engaging with China, but in the Arctic, China is seen as a party that emboldens Russia and compounding the threat that Arctic states face from Russia. So to the extent that South Korea wants to be an Arctic player, that's a complicating factor. There might be some opportunities in the Japan, China, South Korea trilateral mechanism that already exists to engage in some science cooperation, let's say. But that would have to be configured so that it's not dual use science, so that it's climate science, really, or something that's separated from military uses. But I don't know what's going to happen, so that's a question to watch for all of us.
Very briefly on the second point, I do think it's a fateful question for the North Pacific generally, and also for the issues we're talking about today about this presidential election. If the conservatives ultimately, well, really a constitutional court question, if the conservatives remain in power, I think the role of South Korea as a defense provider in particular, which has become quite dynamic in the last couple of years, I guess now number 4, number 5 in the world, with huge procurements to Poland and Romania and several countries. And then this extremely interesting question of the supply of submarines to Canada. That, it would seem to me, could emerge and expand. And we talk about icebreakers. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, the oldest in the United States, has been acquired now by a Korean firm. Yeah, Hanwha, which of course has become a very dynamic international defense provider. So on with the conservatives in power, you have that line, how that would be affected by the shift to the progressives. That, to me, a big question mark, both for Canada and for the Arctic and for the world more general.
All right, well, I just want to thank all 4 of you to taking your time and making your way down here to SAIS to hop on this panel and bearing with me and my team about all the coordinations. But that's all, folks. That would be our event. Thanks you all for also coming to our event, offering your support. It's a great turnout. Probably one of the best ones we had at SAIS this year. And if you're still hungry, please on your way, get some more pizza. Or we're gonna have to send it up to 2nd floor. It's gonna be a crazy frenzy of just, all students here are brutal, but once again, thank you all. Thank you, Professor Sands, for making this possible, supporting us, and we hope you have a great time here.